everyone, and welcome to Cornerstone Online. My name is Rachel, and I'm so glad you're hanging out with us today. In just a few minutes, our band is going to play a couple songs, and then Pastor Fred will continue our sermon series, Prepare to Move On. Now, let's continue spending time with God. We're going to share with you a clip from one of our chapel sessions. As our tech and worship teams meet with God, we want you to do the same. We hope this song reminds you that you are loved and chosen by God.
Jesus said that we're supposed to lay up treasure in heaven rather than on earth. He said on earth your money is just too vulnerable. All sorts of people can steal it or it can be wasted. But in heaven it bears eternal rewards. And he says that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Notice that there's two things he's saying there. One, he's saying when you take what God has given you and invest it in his kingdom, it's a better investment. It yields eternal rewards. But he also says that when you do that, your heart is changed. He doesn't say put your money where your heart is. He says put your money in God's kingdom and your heart will be drawn to God's kingdom. And that's why offering is so important. It's something that we do that actually transforms our hearts. When we deliberately and regularly give to God's work, our hearts are drawn away from ourselves and our money to what God is doing in the world. So that's why it's so important that we give together. I want to remind you that there are several different ways that you can give. You can give physically by check, putting it into one of our giving areas here at church, or mailing it to the church. But you can also give on our website, you can give on our app, and you can do direct deposit. All of them are ways of deliberately giving to God and trusting that as we do, he will change our hearts. Life-changing moments tend to get seared into our memory, especially when those life-changing moments involved a message from God, and whether those life-changing moments are a matter of life and death. All of that was on the line when Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai in God's presence, praying and fasting and asking God for direction. Moses thought that everything that had happened was about to explode and be lost forever. God had rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. He had led them into the wilderness, but now the people had turned their backs on God. And he thought it was all going to be for naught. And so he spent that whole time praying and seeking God, and eventually he got a message. It was a message that he brought down to the people of that generation, and it's a message that he relays a generation later in Deuteronomy chapter 10. It's what we're looking at this morning. And I think it's notable because Moses is telling a story of what happened 38 or 40 years earlier. But you can hear that he says this message is current. He sees that this message is meant for the generation he's talking to now. And I think by extension, this is a message for you and I as well. Because in short, what Moses is talking about is, why are you here? What does God want of you? Why has God kept you around? What is his call on your life? It is the very heart of everything that God is saying to us through this series in Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy chapter 10, starting in verse 10, is where he relays the part about being on the mountain. He says this, "Now I had stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, as I did the first time, and the Lord listened to me, and this time also it was not his will to destroy you. Go, the Lord said to me, and lead the people on their way so that they may enter and possess the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." And so the message was this: it was not his will to destroy you. Though the people had been disobedient, though they had turned their backs on God, it was not God's will to destroy them. Instead, he still had a plan for them. And so he said, go and tell them what I want them to know and take them to the promised land. And so now in Deuteronomy, this is again a generation earlier, he says in verse 12, he says, "And now Israel, what does the Lord, your God, ask of you?" And that's what he says. This is what I'm trying to tell you. We are about to enter a whole new world. What does the Lord ask of you? And I think that what he says to them echoes to us. We are about to enter a new world. We are definitely turning a page in history. And so what does God ask of us, of you and me? Verse 12, "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. This is the heart. This is the message of really, the rest of Deuteronomy is just explaining what he means here. He says, this is what I want. Fear the Lord, walk with the Lord, love, serve the Lord, and observe the Lord's commands. Together, they paint a picture of a people who serve God wholeheartedly in every area of their lives. He is saying, as you go into the promised land, here's what I want. I want you to be people whose lives are centered on me. I want you to fear in the Bible means to reverence. It means to hold God in a position of reverence. So to reverence God as God, to live as the people who take God seriously, but also very practically to observe his commands and to do what he says. And then the heart of it, to love God. And then he says to serve him and to observe his commands. Notice that there's a balance here of emotions and of actions. You know, the emotions are to fear and to love, right? And of course, if you have a love relationship with somebody, if you really love somebody, then their heart, their will, their desires are going to change your life. Right? You're going to be affected by what they desire. So when we have a love relationship with God, then we want to know what his will is, and we will change our lives to follow his will. Because after all, he's not just somebody that we love. We would change our lives for anybody that we loved, but he is God. And so we should change our lives to absorb and to follow his life completely. And so he says, this is what I want. You are moving into the promised land. On every border, there'll be other countries, people who do not know me. They don't understand me, they don't worship me, but you are to be the people who do worship me. And I am calling you to be my people. At the heart of it is a love relationship with God that affects every area of our lives. Interesting that these are balanced, because if you think about it, if our relationship with God is just emotions, you know, we go to services and we hear the music and we're very moved, then it's largely just sentimentality. If it's just actions, if you say, I follow God and I'm just going to do what he says, but I have no personal relationship with him, then it just becomes either formalism or worse, even legalism. And, you know, both of them get shortchanged. The sentimentality becomes disillusionment, and the formalism can become resentment, because they have to be balanced. We obey God. We walk in his ways out of love for him. So that's a big call. That's a big ask. Moses is saying, I'm not asking you a small thing. I'm asking you a huge thing. I'm asking you to recenter your life, to take it off of those foreign gods or off of yourself and to put it on me and to center your life on following me. I want it to be the whole of your life. And so that's a big ask. Why would he ask something so huge? So he continues, if you look in verse 14, in verse 14, he's going to give a rationale, because he's going to say, this is who God is, and this is what God does, and this is how you're going to respond. And then in verse 17, he's going to say the same thing. He's going to say, this is who God is, and this is what God does, and this is how you're supposed to respond. Because I think he's saying, if you're going to have a love relationship with God, if it's going to affect every area of your life, then you have to know who God is. So he says, this is who God is. This is what he does. This is how you're supposed to respond. Look what it says in verse 14. To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Yet the Lord has set his affections on your ancestors and loved them, and he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations as it is today. And then he says, circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. So there's the statement. What does he say about God? He says, to the Lord your God belong all the heavens, even the highest heavens, and everything on earth. He's basically saying, I'm calling you to a wholehearted, love, obedient relationship with God, because he's the only power worth centering your life on. He's the only one, because he is the main God of all the earth. All the heavens and all the earth belong to him. When you look around, everything you see is God's domain. Everything that you can see in the heavens is God's domain. As far as we can see, we get pictures of the Hubble telescope and we can see black holes deep in space. We can see stars beginning, stars exploding, stars dying. All of that is God's. Everything that we can see belongs to God. And so what else would you follow? Who else would you follow? And he says, but here's the amazing thing. He is God of all the universe. He is God of all the world. And yet he has chosen your ancestors to reveal himself to. He said that's what the Exodus story is all about. That's what the plagues and the Passover are all about. That God said, I am going to reveal myself to the world, but I'm going to do it through you people. And he says he chose your ancestors, and through them he's chosen you. He chose Abraham, and then Abraham's descendants, and now this group going into the promised land are the generation after the generation that came out of Egypt. And so through Jesus Christ, you and I become children of God through Abraham. Like we are Abraham's descendants because we've been adopted as God's children by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. And so this call comes to us too. And so God would say to you, I am the Lord of all the earth, but I've chosen you. And I want to reveal myself to the world through you. I want everyone in the world to know who I am and to know what I'm like, but I'm going to do it through you. That's why you're here. And you may be moving into a new world. You may be moving into a new destiny. You may not know what's around the corner. You may not know what you're supposed to be doing, but I know what I want you to be doing. I want you to be my people. I'm going to reveal myself to the world through you and through this community. And that's why he says in verse 16, circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked. This is a strange expression because circumcision is a physical act done on the male body to show that that person belongs to God. But in essence, what he's saying is, what I want is there to be a mark on your heart that shows that you belong to God. I'm not so concerned about outward ceremonies. I want your heart to belong to me. And I want you to be responsive to what I'm saying. Don't be stiff-necked. Stiff-necked is just an expression that means you're being stubborn. You're not listening to what God is saying. Instead, open your heart. Hear what God is saying to you. Hear what God is saying to you. And so what would it look like if we did center ourselves on God? What would it mean if as adopted children of God through Jesus, we centered our lives on Jesus Christ and we took seriously the call to be his people in a world where most people don't know who God is and don't care. In verse 17, he does the same thing. This is who God is, this is what he does, and this is how you're supposed to respond. Look what it says in verse 17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So here it is. Here's who God is. The Lord, your God, is the God of God and the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God. He shows no partiality. And this is what he does. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And this is what we are supposed to do in verse 19. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So what would it look like if we lived as God's people in this world when most people don't care about him? It would be that we would be reflecting his love and his character to those around us, and in particular to the most vulnerable. He says he is the Lord of lords and the God of gods. This expression, the great and mighty, he says he is the great and mighty El. In the ancient pantheon of gods, it was thought that there were a lot of different gods, but there was one God called El. El is like an ancient word for God. There was this one mighty El, and he was the one who presided over all the lords. And so Moses is using that language to speak to his people and say, the one we worship is the mighty El. He is the God over all gods. He is the one. He is in control of all the earth. There really are no other powers. And yet, this great and mighty God, who shows no partiality and he can't be bought, right? You can't appease this God. He can't be bought. You know, he can't be bribed like a king. But that's not to worry, because he's already put his favor on you. He says, this God, he defends the cause of the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner residing among you. And he says, so you should do the same thing. That's a surprising phrase. It might be so common to us that we realize just how shocking it would be. That he says, I am the strongest power in the universe, and I use my power to defend those who are powerless in society. The fatherless, the widow, the foreigner, these were all people who had no power. They had no resource. They had no recourse. You know, if you were living as a widow and didn't have a husband, or if you were living as an orphan, didn't have a father, in that culture you were lost. You had no source of income. You had no source of protection. You were extremely vulnerable. And if you were a foreigner, it meant that you had no recourse to the government. You were subject to prejudice and an outcast. But God says, but I love the outcast. I love the widow. And as my people, I want you to reflect my love by loving those who are on the margins. So we think about applying this. And our first reaction is to see these terms in exactly the same way. But taken broadly, what they are is they're an expression of powerlessness. That God, though he is mighty, protects those who are vulnerable. And he says, if you are my people, and if I'm the center of your life, here's what that's going to mean. It means that you're going to use your power, which means your personal power, your political power, your economic power, your giftings, all those things. You're going to use those things to help those who do not have it. And in doing so, you will reveal my love. So when we hear these terms, our first reaction is to take those terms right into our world and to apply them to ourselves, the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner. And so we look at that and immediately becomes inflamed, because we know just what a polarizing issue immigration has been in our country. Now, I'm no expert in the issues of immigration, that kind of stuff. I'm no political expert, but it would just seem to me that this is an extremely complicated idea. That how to handle immigration in the United States is very complicated. The current administration was very critical of the previous administration about how they handled immigration and all that. And whether you agree with that criticism or not, the point is that now they're in power and things are not better. The problem didn't go away because it's complicated. You have these two things in tension. How can we be a nation that welcomes the immigrant and the refugee and the person looking to start their life over again or looking for safety, and at the same time be a nation of laws where there's a process and where people are welcomed in and there's a pathway to becoming citizens and being a part of participating in our country. We have to uphold law, and we want to be an open country to immigrants. And balancing those things is very complicated. But the point for us is that we are called to live in this country, and we are meant to model God's love for those who are vulnerable. And so above all, we are to love those who are vulnerable. And immigrants aren't the only people who are vulnerable in our culture. The unborn are vulnerable in our country. The poor going to public school in the inner city are vulnerable. I mean, how can we protect and help those who are trying to get a public education in places where it's under-resourced? Young black men are vulnerable in our culture. Single moms are vulnerable in our culture. And so God will start moving in your heart. And he will say, as my people, I want you to extend my love. That's what it will look like if you live as my people in a world where other people don't know you. You will start doing things, and your motivation will be extending my love. He says, I want you to love these outcasts because you were once an outcast. And that leads to the last point. We can almost think in this, if we're not careful, that God calls us to be his people and to love other people, and that's the essence of it. It's all about what happens out there and how we live out our faith out there in the culture. And that's a big part of it, but it's not the only part of it. It reminds us that above all, we as individuals have a love relationship with God. And he closes with this in this chapter in verse 20. He says, "Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you are to praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. Your ancestors who went down to Egypt and were 70 in all, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky." In other words, let's not forget that all that we do in order to love the vulnerable and to show God's love to a dying world and a lost and confused world grows out of our own love relationship with God. He is the one you are to praise. He is the one you are to fear. And you are to live out your salvation story before other people. He says, remember, you were rescued in Egypt. And so he would say to us, remember that at your heart you are a rescued person. God has come into your life through Jesus Christ, atoned for your sins through Jesus' death on the cross, and adopted you as his child. That's your rescue story. And you are to live out your rescue story in a world where other people don't know that they can be rescued. We are to share God's love in a world where people don't know that there is a God who loves them. And this is our call. We as Cornerstone Christian Church are called to be God's people in this particular place and to share with people who don't know it that they can have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, that Jesus can be the center of their family and the center of their lives. And we want to share that love. And we are called to do it together. Whatever the future may bring as we head into this new world, he is calling us to be his people right here. And it only happened as you and I take seriously our growth as followers of Jesus, and as together as a community we take seriously our call to reach out to those who do not know. And by God's grace, that is what we are going to do. And I invite you to be a part of it. As we head into this new world, he says, this is why you're here. So get on board and be a part of what God is doing right now through you in our church. So that's the message, that you have a purpose, and it's to be one of God's people in this world. Let me pray for you. Father, show us how to be your people. Show us how to be your community at this point in the year 2021, to follow you as your people. Show us what that means. And Father, I pray that you would bless each of our individual lives with you, that you would pour out your Spirit into our lives, so at the overflow of your love for us, we would love others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks so much for spending time with us today. If you have any questions about what we talked about today, or if you'd like someone to pray with you, we'd love to do that. If you're hanging out with us live on our website, we have a prayer host here just for you. Don't be shy. Just click on the Request Prayer button, and then you'll join a private chat with you. Now, if you're not watching this live, you can email us at online@cornerstonenj.org, and we will have a pastor or a staff member contact you for prayer. If you're local, we want to invite you to our movie night on Thursday night, August 19th. We'll be featuring the fun family movie A Week Away. We'll be outside watching it on a huge screen, and we'll have snacks and some fun giveaways for the night. The night is absolutely free. All you have to do is bring your own chair. Thanks again for hanging out with us, and have a great rest of your day.